All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Bound Out: The Spiritual Lives of Freeborn Black Domestic Servants. Our presenter today is Jaimie D. Crumley, a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee. She is an assistant professor in the divisions of Gender Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And she's currently working on a book project called We Will Live: Black Christian Feminists in the Age of Revolutions. We Will Live is about Christian women of African descent, contributions to the abolitionist movement in New England from 1770 to 1870. And Jaimie visited our research center in May, so we're really looking forward to hearing a bit about her project and about what she found in our collection. So welcome, Jaimie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share some slides, which I hope that you all can see. Okay, so it looks like that's probably correct. If you are having trouble seeing the slides, feel free to unmute and let me know, because sometimes I can see things on my screen that you cannot see on your end. But thank you so much for the introduction, Jen. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join you all today to discuss some of my recent research. I'm so grateful to the incredible staff at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History for supporting my research. As Jen said, I spent time at the Connecticut Museum in May, and while I was there, I was doing research for Chapter 2 of my book project. I'm grateful to the New England Regional Consortium for making it possible for me to visit several different archival repositories in New England, including the Connecticut Museum, to complete my research. So as you all saw in my brief bio, I am currently working on a book project for a research project that's called We Will Live: Black Christian Feminist in the Age of Revolutions. We Will Live is a 5-chapter monograph that explores different facets of what I call Black biblical feminist political life in New England during the 18th and 19th centuries. The facets the book explores include friendship, liveliness, prayer and singing, fugitivity and refusal, and fictive familial bonds. When I describe the women whose lives and politics I discuss in We Will Live as Black biblical or Black Christian feminist, what I mean is that their political vision was rooted in the lived experiences of Black women. Likewise, they read and interpreted the Bible for themselves. Their interpretations of the Bible were not rooted in the standard New England theology of conquest and the idea that it was the divine order, that some would be high and mighty while others would always be lowly. Rather, they interpreted the Bible as a document that justified their right to live and live well on American soil as women of African descent. They believed that the Bible justified their right to freedom as African people and as women. They participated in political organizing through their anti-slavery societies, mutual aid societies, churches, and private friendships to create the conditions not only for their freedom, but also for the preservation of their lives. So what I want to talk to you about today is my research on Maria W. Stewart and how my time at the Connecticut Museum expanded my understanding of the history of Black freedom and unfreedom in the early 19th century in Connecticut. And so I will say, one of the things that's interesting about the spelling of her name is, of course, we look at this and we say Maria as a modern contemporary audience. In the 19th century, this was pronounced Mariah, like there was an H at the end. So she's Maria W. Stewart. So this research that I did at the Connecticut Museum in May is going to be incorporated into Chapter 2 of We Will Live. And Chapter 2 is about what I call Maria W. Stewart's unordained ministry. So by 1831, Stewart believed that she was called by God to speak in defense of people of African descent. She began writing essays and giving speeches. At the time that she began on the abolitionist speaking circuit, she was young, she was recently widowed, and she was a woman of African descent. And her choice to be so public about her politics was extremely controversial. Yet she persisted in public speaking around the Boston area for 3 years. Her activism and work as an educator anticipated the women's era that would commence in the late 19th century under the leadership of Black women who wanted to ensure what they called racial uplift. Many scholars have rightfully described Stewart as the United States' first exemplar of Black feminist thought. And so in this chapter, what I'm going to do is track how and why she developed her theology and politics. And what I want to argue is that the seeds of her thought were planted in the early 19th century, long before she moved to Boston. Her formative years were spent in Connecticut, which is where she learned about freedom, religion, and service. And so today I'm going to discuss how being a young Black girl who was indentured into the household of Reverend Abel Flint in the early 19th century in Connecticut might have influenced her later political thought. And what I do want to say about this is I went to the Connecticut Museum in May. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I found there, but this is still very much a work in progress. I'm still thinking through these concepts. I've thought a lot about Maria Stewart's political thought. I've been writing about her on and off for a long time. But I've mostly thought about her political thought during her Boston years and then later when she was an older woman living in Washington, D.C. And this is really my first foray into thinking about what her childhood must have been like, living as a freeborn Black woman in Connecticut. And so these are still very much kind of ideas that I still have in progress. I'm still thinking about what it means that she served as an indentured servant, which, as you all know, is the subject of today's talk. And so none of this is kind of definitive or finished. These are just the ideas that I'm thinking about as a result of my most recent research excursion at the Connecticut Museum. So I want to begin by providing some context for my research. So I've been studying Maria W. Stewart's theology and politics on and off since about 2013. And those of you in the room who are researchers will probably not be surprised to learn that I stumbled upon her writing really almost by accident. I was a Master of Divinity student at Yale Divinity School at the time, and I received an assignment in my American Religious History survey course to write an essay about a primary source of my choosing. And all that I needed to do was ensure that that primary source exemplified an aspect of American religious history. And at the time, in 2013, I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea where to begin. And really, I had very little interest in completing that assignment. But I had a really encouraging teaching assistant. And so he helped me to narrow my focus for the assignment. So I decided that I would seek out a narrative of a Black woman religionist from the early 19th century. I made an appointment at the Beinecke Library at Yale University, where for the first time I laid my eyes upon a copy of Maria W. Stewart's 1831 tract, which is called Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build. The courageous words penned by the recently widowed 28-year-old Black woman, which she wrote from Boston, Massachusetts, fascinated me for a few reasons. First, her words fascinated me because she was incisive and strident about her political vision for Black liberation. Second, her words fascinated me because of her sharp analysis about race, and especially about how race functioned for women of color. She stated that Black women had for far too long been compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles. This language that she used spoke to the deeply intimate or domestic nature of racism for Black women in the 19th century. And third, her words fascinated me because she articulated her political vision through the lens of what she called religion and the pure principles of morality. I can only describe Maria Stewart as a secular preacher. She treated the Bible as a sacred American political text. It is clear that Maria Stewart read and interpreted the Bible on her own terms. She interpreted the Bible not as one Black woman who represented all Black women. Rather, she interpreted the Bible through the lens that the text was written especially for her. Other historians of the 19th century United States will be aware of the fact that most of the leading thinkers of the 19th century used the Bible in their political discourse. What interested me, though, about Stewart was the distinctive way that she used the scriptures. She did not use the Exodus narrative or any traditional passages about Jesus's life and ministry, which was very common among political speakers at the time. Instead, Stewart used more obscure text, deploying them with little to no overt interpretation, yet deploying them masterfully to make a point about the human condition. So, for example, in our 1831 tract, she spoke of others who perhaps more eloquently than she could, quote, plead the cause of virtue and the pure principles of morality, end quote. She pulled from Proverbs chapter 31, verse 10, as she wondered who could find a virtuous woman. Her purpose in quoting the scripture was to instill pride in women that they could shift the course of history. While the scripture is traditionally deployed as one that encourages women to be good helpers in their households, Stewart interpreted a virtuous woman as one who spoke publicly and eloquently about the problems of the day and how religion could resolve those problems. At a time when ideologies of womanhood stated that women should remain in the private or domestic sphere, Stewart was one of many women in Connecticut and throughout New England who refused to be a woman of virtue only within the private space of her home. So during my 2013 discovery of Stewart, I learned that in 1831, she had become one of the first United States-born women of any race to make a political address before mixed audiences of men and women. As I studied more, I learned about just how remarkable and daunting she was. She took a distinctive approach to abolition and women's rights. While she was a clear opponent of white supremacy, she was also highly critical of other Black people. She urged her fellow people of African descent to uplift themselves. In her 1831 essay, she wrote, quote, "Shall it any longer be said of the daughters of Africa, they have no ambition, they have no force? By no means. Let every female heart become united, and let us raise a fund for ourselves. At the end of 1 year and a half, we might be able to lay the cornerstone for the building of a high school," end quote. She further urged them to, quote, "possess the spirit of men, bold and enterprising, fearless and undaunted. Sue for your rights and privileges. Know the reasons that you cannot attain them," end quote. When I first encountered Stewart's words, they struck me as a form of encouragement. However, as I became more well-versed in Black women's history, her words began to surprise me. And they shock me more and more every time I encounter them. To borrow from the early 20th century words of Black clubwoman Nannie Helen Burroughs, Stewart urged her fellow Black women to specialize in the wholly impossible. Her personal history as a Black woman who faced opposition at every stage of her life would have made her aware that she demanded far too much. For example, when she says, "sue for your rights and privileges and know the reasons why you cannot attain them," that line even there is so fascinating in light of Stewart's personal history right before she wrote this. She was married and her husband died within 3 years. Her husband was a veteran of the War of 1812. And after her husband died, she was defrauded of the pension that was due to her as his widow. So even her use of this phrase, "sue for your rights and privileges, know the reasons why you cannot attain them," is always so fascinating to me in light of her own personal history. But it's also fascinating if we go to the end of her life and see that in the last year of her life, she finally received support from a younger woman who went from where she lived in Washington, D.C. up to Boston, combed through the records of Stewart's life, spoke to other living people of color who would have remembered James and Maria Stewart from their time in Boston, which was then 50 years in the past, and finally was able to secure her the pension that was due to her. And she finally was able to get her rights and privileges. So in what ways were these words actually prophetic, right? Carry on suing for your rights and privileges until you do attain them. It's difficult to say. Obviously, Stewart would have had no idea in 1831 that she would live to finally receive what was due to her. So Maria W. Stewart, let's get to Connecticut. She was born Maria Miller on September 4th, 1803. She was the child of Caesar and Lib, who were Black residents in Connecticut. Let's talk a little bit about slavery in Connecticut. So on the eve of the American Revolution, there were 6,464 people being held in slavery in Connecticut. Connecticut had the highest number of enslaved people at that time of any state in New England. And in 1784, Connecticut implemented a gradual emancipation policy. So any child who was born in Connecticut after March 1st, 1784, would not legally be held in slavery after they reached the age of 25. And so I'm providing this context not because Maria Stewart was an enslaved woman, but rather because I want us to understand the tapestry of her life and what was happening in the background of her life and what she would have seen during her childhood. So she was born free in 1803, but it was a state where Black freedom was not the norm. She was surrounded all around her by Black people who were not free. And so I think it's important that we understand just how uncommon her status of being legally free from birth as a Black person in Connecticut was in 1803. And I think that helps us also to understand her affinity for abolitionist work by the time she went to Boston as a young woman. She was raised in the context of a state where there was still a lot of slavery going on during her entire childhood. So in her brief autobiographical notes about her childhood, which appear in the introduction of her tract, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build, Stewart claimed that she was born in Hartford, Connecticut. However, the record of her birth appears in Greenwich, Connecticut town records. Stewart, who married shipping agent James W. Stewart in 1826, shared very little about her childhood before her parents' deaths. She does not indicate how her parents died or precisely when each parent died, but she does write that by the age of 5, she was an orphan. She faced the same fate as many others who became orphans in white working class families and many Black families. She was what she calls bound out. And that's the phrase that was used a lot at this time. When we see records, there'll be just the records of the children who were bound out. And it tells us exactly when that child was indentured, to whom they were indentured, and for how long they were indentured. So it's not uncommon, her experience of being bound out, especially as a young child who was left as an orphan. And she, of course, was a Black female child. So this was not uncommon. However, what is uncommon about it is that after this experience, Stewart went on to become a prominent Black abolitionist. It's amazing that she did that as a woman. And of course, both of those things were uncommon in the 19th century. Many of the Black women's abolitionists who we know, of course, you all know about, like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who of course were women who self-emancipated and took themselves to freedom. But a lot of the really prominent Black abolitionists in the North happened to be women who were freeborn into more elite families. And so they were raised learning how to read and write, learning about politics. That's not Stewart's story. So while she doesn't have the story of a Harriet Tubman or a Sojourner Truth, she still has the story of a person who was kind of on the margins and who we wouldn't have expected to become this great abolitionist based on her early life history. So being bound out as an apprentice or a domestic servant, of course, is not at all akin to being enslaved. These are very different conditions. However, the folks who were being bound out were children who were already living on the margins of society because of their skin color, because of their social class, or because of some combination of the two. And being bound out just reveals how normalized life on the spectrum of unfreedom was in New England's early history. I'm not going to be able to go through too much of Stewart's later political thought. I'm just going to focus on religion and the pure principles of morality in the interest of time. But one of the things that I'll be interested in doing in the chapter is continuing to think a lot more about how Stewart's early experiences influenced her political thought throughout her time in Boston. But I'm just going to focus on religion and the pure principles of morality just for the purposes of this talk, because we don't have too much time. So to be bound out, means to be indentured into servitude in a private household. There are some young white men who chose to be indentured by a man who they believed could teach them a trade. However, indenture in New England often took a more insidious character by coercing free labor from working class and orphan children. And I want to make clear that the people who became indentured servants were children who were under the age of 18. They were not yet adults. They were people who were already vulnerable, and their vulnerabilities only increased when they were bound out. So I'm going to show you a copy of an indenture contract. This is not Maria Stewart's indenture contract, but I'm going to show you the contract, which I know you cannot read. You cannot read that. It's difficult for me to read, even blown up. But basically they had these kind of typed indentured contracts, like you can see here, and then it was just filled in handwriting who the person was, to whom they were being indentured, exactly how long they would be in service. And then we see the signatures at the bottom of the people who witnessed the indenture. So this document is the indenture of Mary Smith, who was a Black girl in Massachusetts. She was indentured in 1769. So Stewart's indenture might have looked a little bit different from this, but this is kind of the standard way of documenting them. So I think this gives us a feel for the restrictions that were being placed upon the people who were being bound out. So according to this document, Smith was bound out to a man named Nathaniel Ruggles, his wife, and his heirs. And this phrasing indicates that even if something were to happen to Ruggles or his unnamed wife, Smith would legally remain with their family. She was to be with the family until January of 1812, which is when she would be 18 years old. So young women concluded their indentures at 18 and young men at 21. As indentured servants or children who were bound out, their tasks went beyond physical labor. They also did the emotional labor of maintaining their master's or mistress's privacy, doing no harm to the home, and not lending the master or mistress's things to other people. The masters and mistresses also held them to a high standard of behavior and intervened into their private lives. So they could not gamble, they could not fornicate, they could not marry during their time of service. They also could not go to taverns. They were always to behave themselves properly toward their master and mistress. And of course, I don't know that any of this necessarily surprises us because these were Puritan morals. And of course, we know that New England was a region where congregational meeting houses were sitting at the literal physical center of every town. If you live in New England now, or if you've visited New England, you probably have driven past town squares where there is a meeting house or a church, often called the first church, second church, third church, something like that, sitting in the middle of town. And so seeing these kind of rules and regulations and expectations perhaps is not that surprising considering the culture of New England in the 18th and 19th centuries. So as a young woman who was indentured, Stewart would have been taught reading, writing, sewing, knitting, and other skills that she would have needed to be a good housewife. The use of the apprentice system to teach working class white women and Black women how to be proper housewives and framing housewifery primarily through the lens of household tasks rather than the impact of those tasks on the household points to a desire to regulate the homes of non-elites and to prepare them above all else for lives of subservience. So we might imagine that when she was bound out, that the person who indentured Stewart was not only thinking about her life in the immediate, but he might have also been thinking about her future as a woman who might be a housewife in the future, but also as a woman who might do domestic servitude throughout even her adult life. So maybe he was thinking and preparing her for both of those eventualities. So in exchange for their service, servants received food, drink, lodging, and clothing. And then when their term was up, they would be sent away and they would receive two outfits. One was for Sunday worship and the other was for them to use on work days. Now, as I've kind of kept looking into this and really thought about Maria Stewart's experience as an indentured servant and really looked into the man who I believe was the person who held her in his household, it's really changed my understanding of at least how the people who were participating in this system thought about it. They, I don't think, thought about it as an extension of the systems of unfreedom that were common in New England during this time. So I want to talk a little bit more about why I'm thinking that that's the case. So Maria Stewart does not say the name of the family who she served during her time of indenture. Through my research at the Connecticut Museum, I found that I agree with historian Kristen Waters, who wrote a 2021 book called Maria W. Stewart and the Roots of Black Political Thought. And one of the things that Dr. Waters says that she believes is that she thinks that Stewart served her indenture in the household of Reverend Abel Flint. So from 1791 until his health failed in 1824, Reverend Flint was the minister of the Second Church in Hartford. Because she was bound out to a family in Hartford in 1808, which is when she was only 5 years old, it is possible that Stewart did not know that Hartford was not the same place that she was born. So in her written memory of her own life, she says that she was born in Hartford in 1803. And then later she says she was bound out to a clergyman's family. So I'm imagining that maybe the reason that she says that she was born in Hartford, even though as it turns out she was born in Greenwich, might have been because she ended up in Hartford at such a young age. So to return to Flint, he was a member of the Charitable Society of Hartford. In 1810, he delivered a speech before the North Presbyterian Meeting House in Hartford. He gave the speech to support the Female Beneficent Society. His message was that everyone should do charity work because Jesus said that it was more blessed to give than to receive. And so he praised the society because it supported, quote, 10 young females who for a short time since had no prospect before them but indigence and its attendant evils, are schooled, clothed, and fostered, end quote. So I think this is a really interesting speech that he made. It has nothing to do with his own identity as a person who was holding young indentured servants in his household. But if we apply Flint's logic to his own household, we might conclude that he believed that bringing Stewart into his home as a domestic servant was an extension of his Christian charitable spirit. It's fascinating that he says that indigence, that is poverty, comes with attendant evils. And so it's really compelling that he might have thought that he was doing the work of saving her from something far worse than being indentured in his household. And in fact, that he might have thought being indentured in his household would have been part of the greatest good for her as a young girl, to prepare her for the next stages of her life and to offer her a proper path in life that she perhaps might not have had, in his mind at least, without his intervention. And I think Stewart might have agreed with that because she only offers us a passing reference to her indenture, but it indicates that she believed that being indentured was part of what set her. It doesn't seem like she's saying that was the entirety of her spiritual development, but she's saying it's part of what set her on her spiritual path. So her opening statement about her life is as follows. She writes, quote, "I was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803, was left an orphan at 5 years of age, was bound out to a clergyman's family, had the seeds of piety and virtue early sown in my mind, but was deprived of the advantages of education, though my soul thirsted for knowledge," end quote. So I've read this phrase a million times and had a million different thoughts about it. But I think it can be read in any number of ways. And if we pair what Abel Flint thinks about charity with Maria Stewart's real commitment to spiritual life, her statement that she had the seeds of piety and virtue sown in her mind, I think one way to read this phrase might be that she believed that being bound out was part of what helped her to develop herself as a pious and virtuous person. And I imagine that if she framed her indenture in this way, it might have contributed to her later political thought. We remember that her first abolitionist essay that she ever read or that she ever wrote that was circulated was about religion and the pure principles of morality. So perhaps she thought that the limitations of indenture, which required so much of her in terms of morality, and we can only imagine how much it might have required of her as the indentured servant of a man who was a prominent minister in her town. It might have been that she really believed that indenture was part of what set her on a path to understanding religion, morality, and virtue, and believing that those three things could lead to Black liberation. So Stewart says that she left the clergyman's family when she was 15 years old. And I think her statement that she left at 15 is also really telling because that's unique, considering most women were not done with their indenture, or their indenture contracts at least said that they wouldn't have been leaving until they were 18. So I think that's really fascinating and might tell us something about her relationship with the Flint family. I don't know exactly what that is that it tells us. Maybe that's something we can talk about more during the Q&A, and certainly something I'm going to be thinking about as I'm putting together this chapter. But I think that that's really fascinating because that's unique, that she was leaving allegedly 3 years before her term would have been, before she would have completed her term. So after leaving her indenture, she writes that she attended Sabbath schools until she was 20 years old. In the early 19th century, education in the United States began to shift. It was previously managed by churches, and then it began to transition into the more contemporary public school system that's familiar to most of us. And so a phase in this transition was the establishment of what were called Sabbath schools, sometimes called Sunday schools. And so they weren't the same thing as when we think about children going to Sunday school at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, or at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, whatever day Sunday schools or Sabbath schools are held in a tradition that you might be familiar with. It was different from that. These institutions began as schools that were for underprivileged children. And in these schools, they were supposed to be learning basic literacy skills, and they were also supposed to receive moral and religious instruction. So some Sabbath schools met for 3 or more hours on a Sunday afternoon, and others would meet for 2 hours in the morning and then 2 more in the afternoon. So this was the first time that Stewart was able to receive access to what she calls knowledge, because she was able to learn to read and write. She was able to learn basic literacy skills. And so I imagine that it was in the Sabbath schools that she began to develop as a religious writer. I think she already had a lot of those ideas in her, but being able to write them down and express them was something that would have been new to her. What she writes about her experience in Sabbath school is very brief, but it indicates that it was her choice to participate in the Sabbath schools that she attended. The ways that she learned what she calls piety and virtue point to the reasons that she might have pursued what I call in We Will Live an unordained ministry. You might be familiar with the idea of ordination that is formal within churches, or other communities of faith, setting someone apart as a leader of the organization. What I believe that Stewart wanted to do throughout much of her adult life, both as an educator and as an abolitionist speaker, is that she wanted to do the work of a minister. She wanted to do the work of healing people, of bringing people together, of helping people to understand their role and their place in society, of supporting people. And of course, this was something that she did not do in traditional religious spaces, although there was a very religious bend to a lot of her work and a lot of her activism. Instead, she did it in secular places. So this is why I call what she did an unordained ministry, which helped people to pursue social liveliness despite the death-dealing conditions that were so common for Black people in New England during this time. So in her writing, Stewart does not indicate to us why she decided to leave Connecticut and why she moved to Boston. I'm thinking that perhaps because slavery was continuing to persist in Connecticut up until the middle of the 19th century, that she might have been eager to join a rich community of free Black people in Boston. Perhaps she wanted to be with others who shared a similar status to her of being free from enslavement. For those who don't know, I'll just provide a little bit of context that slavery was declared unconstitutional. I shouldn't say it was illegal or abolished, but it was declared counter to the Constitution of Massachusetts in the early 1780s. And then in the 1790 census, we don't see any Black people being held as enslaved people if we look at the Massachusetts state census, we look at the census. And so it makes sense that she might have wanted as a free person to be able to be in a place where Black people were free. So that could have influenced her choice to move. And as a young woman who was pursuing education and who was so bright and who was interested in knowledge, it would have made sense that she would have wanted to be in a community where there was so much rich exchange happening over all sorts of political and intellectual issues. But it's also possible that she could have moved because she had friends in Boston. For example, if we look at religion and the pure principles of morality, she speaks really fondly about David Walker, who was one of the great abolitionists, Black abolitionists of the time. By 1831, when she began her time on the abolitionist speaking circuit, David Walker had already died. He died in 1829. But that meant that she would have gotten to know him a little bit, and he inspired so much of her political thought. But she also could have moved because of romance or love. We know that she had a burgeoning relationship with her husband, and that could have compelled her to move from Hartford to Boston. In 1826, she married James W. Stewart, who was a shipping agent who lived in Boston and a veteran, as I said earlier, of the War of 1812. So perhaps she moved because she was interested in pursuing that relationship with him. That's one thing I've been really interested in some of the newer scholarship coming out about Black women abolitionists and Black women in New England, this real attentiveness to their intimate lives and how much intimacy, meaning friendship and romance, might have shifted some of the moves that they made throughout their lives, right? So it wasn't all compelled by this great political vision that they had, although a lot of them had that, but it was also compelled by these very personal reasons of wanting to be able to be in a community with other people who they loved, whether they loved those people platonically or romantically. We know that Maria Stewart was left a widow in 1829. And then she says that she experienced a spiritual and political conversion in 1830. And so she declared her faith publicly in 1831. And she says that this public declaration of faith compelled her to speak on issues that were facing people of African descent. So Maria Stewart tells us so little about her personal life, especially her personal life before she reached the age of 18. We have later documents where she tells us quite a bit about her life, but that was about her life as an older woman living in Washington, D.C. during and after the American Civil War. And I'm really interested in what her life was like as a young girl, because we know that that must have been what shaped so much of her political consciousness as a young woman. And so it's long been a struggle for me conducting research about her because she tells us so little about her personal life. And because, like many other Black women in 18th and 19th century New England, it can be very difficult to find written documentation about her life. Most of what we have because she wrote so extensively and left so much behind. And a lot of that has been preserved by historians who rightly understood the power of her words and the relevance of her place within 19th century American religion and politics. However, even though she only provides us with these small tidbits about her life before the age of 18, I think that we can do a lot of interpretation around the idea of her being bound out as a young girl. And even being able to be in the Connecticut Museum, first of all, just to learn more about the context of slavery in Connecticut, which I admittedly knew too little about, but also just to see these records of charitable societies and see the connections that a lot of people in Connecticut were making around charity and morality and this idea of indenture really helped me to understand her political thought a lot better. Maria Stewart might have considered her indenture not as being part of the spectrum of unfreedom in New England, although she was an intelligent woman, so I'm sure it wasn't lost on her that there were certainly some parallels. But rather, she might have seen it as an opportunity to pursue piety. Even within her indenture, she might have discovered new dimensions of herself. She took pride in her spirituality. We can see that even under conditions of restraint, Stewart asserted herself, and she claimed moments where she could for freedom. She also left her indenture before she was 18. She attended Sabbath schools because she believed it was important for her to pursue not only spiritual knowledge, but also temporal knowledge. She never separated her identity as a person who was committed to what she called religion and morality from her identity as a person who was always striving for learning. Throughout her life, she remained bound out to a sense of divine calling to God and to the people who she believed that God had called her to serve. One of the things that we learn if we study Stewart throughout her life is that she was deeply committed to education. And she was committed as an educator. After she left Boston, she immediately went to New York, where she pursued a career as an educator, and then later in the Washington, D.C. area, started her own school. But what we can see at this earlier stage in her life, when she's indentured and then later decides to go to Sabbath schools, is that she was passionate about education for herself. It wasn't just that she wanted to educate others. She educated herself at a young age and was an educator after she left Boston. And I think that perhaps her experience of being bound out offered her her first opportunity to engage with what would become her rigorous pedagogy of spirituality. The kinds of expectations that were placed on her as a young girl in the Flint household were not unlike the expectations that she placed on the young people who she worked with as an educator, and eventually as a woman who started her own school. So Stewart's decade in servitude offers a new way for us to think about the history of domestic servitude. We often have thought of domestic servitude as a form of unfreedom, and certainly it was that. We know that they weren't being well compensated. They were just receiving the basic necessities of life. There were strict regulations about behavior. And when they left with, for the most part, we see them leaving with just clothes. There are some examples that I've seen in indenture records of, young white men especially, where sometimes the person who was their master or mistress would also send them off with a little bit of money. But I've never seen an indenture of a Black person where they were also sent off with money. So we know that this was not necessarily an equal relationship. It definitely operated as a form of unfreedom. However, I also think that from reading more of Stewart's work and from thinking more about the family with whom she shared her term of indenture, indenture for her was one of the first of many lessons in her spiritual life. It taught her to be faithful to God under all circumstances. It sowed the seeds of a lifelong commitment to an unordained ministry, of pleading her cause alongside the cause of other marginalized people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaimie. It was really interesting. If anyone has any questions, if they'd like to go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can certainly unmute yourself. I had a couple of questions while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts. Is it do you think that it is purposeful that she never mentions who she was indentured to, or is that just irrelevant to her?
I think that's a really good question. It's something that I always grapple with her. Why does she give us so little information? If she didn't leave until she was 15, she certainly knew exactly what their names were. So it's fascinating that she shares so little. But she shares so little so quickly at the beginning of her tract, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality. And so I'm thinking, she does share her husband's name, but not really anything about him. I'm thinking that she really wanted to give us that little bit of context just as a way of almost introducing herself, and then wanted to just get straight into the heart of her message, which was, of course, about abolition, women's rights, and the importance of religion to both of those things. And so I think, it's so fascinating because as we keep reading through that document, she says, some of you will complain, religion is her only theme. And so I think she was hyper aware of herself and how she was being perceived. And she was very comfortable with that. She didn't necessarily want to reveal too much at this stage in her life. And I think that's really fascinating. And I'll also say, as a sidebar, which you didn't ask about, it's one of the other things that I struggle about in my research with her and with other Black women from this time who don't tell us a lot about their personal lives. How much am I supposed to dig into the personal life?
Right.
How much should I just let it be, as they were clearly comfortable letting it be?
Right.
So I think that's one of the struggles as a researcher. How do I respect clearly their desire for us just to talk about their politics, while also recognizing that all of us, for all of us, as a Black feminist, I believe all of our politics come from somewhere. It doesn't come, it comes from our lived experiences. So I believe we must understand their lived experiences if we fully want to understand their political thought.
Right. That leads me to another question. If she left at 15, as it seems, what would her options have been at that age to become an indentured servant for someone else, or what kind of options did she have?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if she left to become a domestic and to earn her own money and just live on her own. I don't know. I don't really know what her plan was there. Clearly, she was successful enough in whatever she wanted to do. And it seems like she dedicated a lot of her time to her schooling, but how she supported herself, I
Right.
think, is like another question there, because it still was, I don't know exactly when she went to Boston, but it was still a bit of time before she went to Boston. And we know, of course, in New England during this time in general, it was New England and throughout the North, right? We also see this in Philadelphia. Most Black women who are not born into elite households spend most of their time being domestic workers. So perhaps she wanted the opportunity to be able to work by and for herself and be able to live independently and be able to have options to travel and to go where she wanted to go, which of course would not have been available to her as an indentured servant in the Flint household.
Right. So we do have a question connecting to that. Um, the question is, in your research, have you been able to determine, how she left before she was 18, the typical age?
I have not been able to find why she's saying that she left at 15. Maria Stewart is so fascinating to me because I think even in that brief little statement she gives about her life, I also wonder how much of this is precisely factual. I'm just because, obviously I understand that she might have been wrong about the place where she was born because she wouldn't, of course, who remembers where they were born? You like go on your parents' reference about that.
Right.
I'm but I also do tend to think, okay, if that was not quite right, I wonder if there were other things that were not quite right. One of the things that we also know, then, it does seem to be kind of on the record that she was born in 1803, but we also know that there could have been things that were not quite right about that, even though it is documented that she was born in 1803. We know at this time that a lot of Black people didn't even know their date of birth, didn't know their precise date of birth. So I wonder even about where some of those records are coming from. And then if we look at her will at the end of her life, most historians believe that she died in 1879, which I think is probably correct. Her will isn't filed until like pretty late in 1880, which means either that it was just like a slippage in documentation where it's just kind of like, okay, this didn't get in until 1880, so it makes it look like she actually died in 1880, or even that year isn't correct. So I think it can be difficult to really kind of ascertain all the years with her. And I'm not even sure it'll be something that I'll think a lot more about, I think, before I actually put out the chapter.
Right.
Is that even really what's important to the story that I want to tell? Or if it is important, like you all said, I do think I need to fill out a little bit more what were the lives of Black women who weren't in indentures but still needed to support themselves, which was kind of Stewart's like ongoing problem throughout her life. She only had 3 years in which she was married. She never married again in her life, so she spent a lot of her life supporting herself, and a lot of that time she spent being an educator, and also of course earning as much money as she could off of being an abolitionist speaker. So I think she was a very resourceful woman. So I think we can imagine her having done any number of things while domestic servitude would have been most typical. Perhaps that's not precisely how she spent her time during those years before she moved to Boston.
Are there any records left behind by Abel Flint that talk about his indentured servants that he had in his home, or?
So I looked as much as I could find about Abel Flint when I was at the Connecticut Museum. I'm going to have to search around in your records to see if there's any more that I could find. He doesn't have a ton of documents left behind, at least not that I was able to find at the museum. So that's something also that I need to kind of keep looking into. I if he is saying anything about his own household, because we mostly see him saying things about charity is good. I'm which I definitely connect to him talking about his own experience being a person who had indentured servants in his household. But yeah, I definitely need to do a lot more work into Abel Flint and what was he up to and what was he thinking about.
Right. Lenora had a comment that she understands you talked about Maria stated she longed for education, and she wanted to let us know that her grandmother, born in 1897, longed to be educated, but her father wouldn't allow it at that time. But she did learn to read, and she had beautiful penmanship. And I think that is typical. I think there are other factors at play that didn't allow people to get the education they sought out, were seeking. Thank you,
Yeah, I
Maria.
think that's actually a great point, Leora, about your I guess I would have great grandfather who wouldn't allow her to go to school. One thing I always think about with Stewart is I really important actually that her father died when she was young. She only had her husband for 3 years, and during those 3 years that she had her husband, I'm imagining that she was involved in abolitionist work at some level because she was such a close friend of David Walker. She was living in Boston. She was attending events at the African Meeting House. The two of them were married at the African Meeting House, and there were always a lot of both religious, educational, and political events that were happening there. So I know that she was well aware of abolition. But I also think it's really fascinating that she says that it wasn't until 1830 that she felt she was truly converted. And then in 1831 that she makes a public declaration of her faith, even though she says that she had been educated in religion and morality and all of that long before she met her husband. And like I said, she was working with David Walker. She was well aware of abolition. But it wasn't until all of those men are kind of from in the past that she really is able to put some of the religious training and the political knowledge that she had to work for herself. And it's not until she leaves the indenture that she's able to go to Sabbath school and pursue her own education. So I think there's something to be said for that for a lot of 19th century women. And I found this throughout a lot of the women who I've studied. Either they leave their husbands or they choose to never marry or their husbands die. And that I think is a large part of the reason why we know these women, why we know them by their own names. And there's one woman who I'm going to be writing about in my book who was the wife of a prominent abolitionist in Boston in the 1850s. And it's hard enough to find things about his life because he wasn't, he wasn't a Frederick Douglass or anything like that. He was a local church pastor, but it's almost impossible to find things about her. And we just see her name all the time on, various church events and programs and events that they were doing to help people who were fugitives from slavery or events that they were doing to raise money for the church. But she's always kind of mediated through the lens of the church and of course through her husband. And I think that that's actually a really important point, that one of the reasons why we can learn as much as we can about Stewart is because we have to go through all of these other people to learn about her. We're able to learn about her kind of on her own terms, which is part of why I try to be cautious in my research with her, because I want to respect that she set for us while also trying to dig as deep as possible to learn more about how her lived experience has influenced her politics. But yes, thank you for that, for sharing that, Lyra.
Such a fine line as a researcher. Really is. Anyone have any other questions? Or again, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I can't wait to hear more about your research as you progress, Jaimie. It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
This is great. We talk about Maria in one of our education programs. So, of course, we want to know everything, but like you said, it is a fine line. Anybody, any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Jaimie, for this interesting talk. Best of luck with the rest of your research. We can't wait we'll have to have you back and give us an update. That would be great. And
Definitely. Thank you.
before we close out, I see one question. How do you think Miss Stewart's speech influenced others or other advocates of her time?
Uh-huh. So that's a great question. Of course, she was part of the community of Black women in New England, and we know that there are Black women who were participating in anti-slavery work and in women's liberation work. And it seemed like they were inviting her to give talks because some of her talks were given to them. She also gave talks at the African Masonic Hall, so we know that she was talking to the Black men of her time, which was very controversial, and she was very critical of them. And she also was forming relationships, for example, with Reverend Alexander Crummell, who was a major minister of the time. She met him in New York when both of them were still very young, and they maintained their relationship into her older adulthood in Washington, D.C. He later became the minister at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., which is still a Black-led church. And Maria Stewart, in her will, she leaves money to him and to that church so that they can maintain their work. And so I think in so many ways, both as an educator and also as a political thinker, she was so much a part of the political discourse of her time. And so many were influenced by her, but also so many were like troubled by her and didn't like her approach and did not appreciate her publicness as a Black woman, didn't appreciate her approach to, like I said, I think she said some things to and about Black women that were perhaps beyond what they should have been expected to do. A lot of historians have kind of critiqued her support of what's often called the politics of respectability, the idea that basically that Black folks ought to hold themselves to like the high moral standard of anyone out there in order to kind of justify their right to their freedom. So I think she influenced many in both perhaps positive and negative ways. And then certainly what we see by the end of the 19th century, post-slavery, 1880s, we see that this generation of Black women who were born in the 1860s and 1870s, the first generation of free Black women, we see that they were really committed to what people call race work, right, which is racial uplift. And no doubt they would not have been able to do that work had Maria Stewart not opened the door for Black women to be able to speak publicly in this way. So while we don't necessarily see them referencing Maria Stewart directly, we know that a lot of that kind of religious work that she did opened the door for future Black women who really framed their work through these really religious and spiritual terms. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's great. I know this next question, I know you mentioned we don't exactly know how she supported herself after she left her indenture when she was 15, but later in life, was her speeches enough to support herself, or did she have to venture into
No,
other?
she became an educator. She moved to New York. She left Boston. She left Boston because she gives a farewell speech in which she's incendiary and is quite angry, especially with other members of the Black community who she felt like should have supported her. And she also was angry because she just felt like as a religious speaker, like people had basically not supported her in part because she was a religious speaker, but also because she was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so she ends up leaving Boston pretty soon after she starts her time on the abolitionist speaking circuit. She moves to New York. She becomes an educator there. And then later moves to Washington, D.C., continues to be an educator at the school there. But she, especially in the Washington, D.C. years, because that was during the American Civil War and post-war period, she doesn't die until 1879. She really had a hard time supporting herself. And she would ask the churches for as much support as they would give her. Some of the churches wanted to give her support, some didn't. Some of them felt like they didn't like the denomination she belonged to. So she really struggled because she joined the Episcopal Church when she moved to Washington, D.C. And a lot of, the Baptists and the Methodists felt like, oh, she's not supporting us. We don't want to support her. The Episcopal Church at the time was having a lot of, divisions about race. And so a lot of the Black folks who didn't want to support her for being part of the Episcopal Church, their critique is, why do you want to be part of a church that doesn't fully support us as Black people? So that was part of the critique. So she really struggled and suffered, especially during the American Civil War. She writes this like little short autobiography, I guess, that she calls My Sufferings During the War. And it's like quite like sad and devastated about just how much she had suffered and whose fault it was that she had suffered. But by the end of her life, she was the Freedmen's Hospital had opened in Washington, D.C., which was where, like free people were going after slavery to try to, get all the medical care and support that they needed. And of course, the Freedmen's Hospital became attached to Howard University. And so she was working there as the matron of the Freedmen's Hospital right before her death. So she had quite a rich life and struggled at many times to support herself as an unmarried woman who insisted upon taking the most difficult path in life.
She sure did. Oh, well, thank you so much, Jaimie. This is really fascinating. I enjoyed this conversation.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
I just wanted to share a couple of upcoming events that we have coming up. We have a lunch and learn next week. We have 2 back-to-back, which I know we don't always do. So we will hear from Brian Sink. He's a professor of English and the department chair at the University of Hartford. He has a new book entitled Published by the Author, Self-Publication in 19th-Century African-American Literature. And he focuses on 19th century writers who use self-publication to bypass white gatekeepers and editors to share their unique stories that address social, political, and economic realities of Black life in the United States. And then also next week on Thursday, we have an artist talk and demonstration. Internationally recognized 7th generation Afghan master potter Mateen Malikzada was forced to flee Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover, and he now has resettled to northwestern Connecticut with his family. And so at this event, you can meet the artist, hear his story of his struggles and joy and creativity, and select pieces of his pottery will be on display and available for purchase. And then on the 17th of October, we have an author talk with John Grinspan. He is the curator of political history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History and the author of a new book, Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War. And this talk actually supports our newest exhibition called Wide Awakes Campaigning for Lincoln. We have quite a bit of items in our collection on the Wide Awakes because these were young anti-slavery activists that formed this group right in Hartford. And it really spurred this nationwide movement that helped elect President Lincoln. So you can come see the exhibition and hear John's talk about his research. So those are just some upcoming events that we have. Of course, you can visit our website to see our whole list. And hopefully we'll see you all next week at the next Lunch and Learn. And thank you again, Jaimie. And we'd love to keep in touch and hear about how your research turns out as you move along in the process.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Jaimie,
everyone.
good luck with your research.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.